Hello and welcome to another episode of The Origin Story of Cartoon. Today, I'm going to ruin your childhood cartoons again. Did you know that many Disney cartoons we remember fondly were originally books before they became cartoons? And did you know that many of these books were not just unsuitable for children, but were so scary that even adults found them terrifying and disturbing? But for some reason, Disney and other companies decided to change these stories and turn them into the famous cartoons we know. So, if you're curious to know the real stories behind Snow White, Pinocchio, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, The Little Mermaid, Alice in Wonderland, and Winnie the Pooh, let's watch the videos together as always. Before I dive into Disney stories, let's talk about Winnie the Pooh because there's a dark theory behind this animation that can change our perspective on it, although it's hard to call it just a theory. Winnie the Pooh is about a boy named Christopher Robin who spends time with a bunch of funny animals. At first glance, everything seems fine and there's nothing wrong with this cartoon. But as usual, when we look deeply into it, it seems like there's always something dark behind everything. The theory says that each of these characters suffers from a mental illness. Let's start with Winnie the Pooh himself. If you notice, Pooh is always searching for honey and he's willing to do anything to get it. Many say that Pooh has impulsivity or possessive disorder. Then we have Piglet, who is always stressed, worried, and panicky, leading people to think he has panic disorder. Next is Owl, who always gets everything backward, leading everyone to think he has dyslexia, a learning disorder. Then there's Tigger. Although loved whenever others help him, they end up in trouble because he's too impulsive, which is similar to those with ADHD, a hyperactivity disorder. Next is Rabbit, who has OCD, obsessing over everything needing to be just right. And then there's Eeyore, who suffers from depression, never able to find happiness and always feeling down.
Morning, Pooh Bear.
If it is a good morning, which I doubt.
Not much of a house. Just right for not much of a donkey.
Lastly, they say Christopher Robin, the only human character, suffers from schizophrenia, causing him to hallucinate that all these animals are affected by his illness and they're not real. Now let's talk about Disney cartoons. The story of Snow White was first written in a book by the brothers Grimm in 1812. First, I'll tell you about Disney's Snow White, then I'll tell you the real story. Disney's Snow White is about a very beautiful girl with red lips and skin as white as snow. Snow White's stepmother, the evil queen, had a magical mirror she asked every day, "Who is the fairest of them all?" It would always say the queen's name until one day it said Snow White's name. The queen, wanting to be the fairest, orders someone to kill Snow White, but the person can't do it, and Snow White meets 7 dwarfs in the forest. When the queen finds out Snow White is still alive, she decides to poison her with a poisoned apple. But in the end, she herself gets killed by thunder, and Snow White comes back to life with a kiss from the prince. They live happily ever after. But the real story goes a bit differently. When Snow White eats the apple and falls unconscious, it's just like you saw in the cartoon. But it doesn't end the same way where the prince comes and kisses her, waking her up. In fact, the prince lifts the coffin Snow White is in and wants to take her somewhere else. Along the way, he accidentally drops her, causing the piece of poisoned apple stuck in Snow White's throat to come out. But from here on, the story gets much darker. Snow White and the prince decide to get married and have a grand wedding, inviting all the kings and queens. The evil queen, who has been Snow White's enemy from the beginning, doesn't know that this wedding is actually Snow White's and the prince's because she thinks Snow White is dead. When she goes to the wedding, Snow White orders them to put the iron shoes, heated with fire, on the queen's feet and forces her to dance all night until her feet burn and she dies from exhaustion and pain. As you can see, this story is not suitable for children, but if you're okay with it, I can tell you more stories. Next is the story of Pinocchio. Let me tell you the story first, and then we'll move on to the real story, which I think is even scarier than all these tales I've told you. The story begins with an old wood carver who creates a puppet. and wishes upon a twinkling star that the puppet becomes a real boy. A fairy appears and grants Geppetto's wish. She tells Pinocchio that if he is honest and selfless, he can become a real boy. Geppetto, overjoyed by this, sends Pinocchio to school the next day. However, at school, a few kids trick Pinocchio into joining a puppet show, promising him fame and fortune, but giving him nothing. When Pinocchio tries to return home, they imprison him until that night when the fairy returns, frees him, and warns him about his actions. But Pinocchio keeps getting fooled and ends up in Pleasure Island, where children indulge in all sorts of pleasures, but eventually turn into donkeys. After some time, Pinocchio and his friends become donkeys and are sold as slaves. There, Pinocchio discovers that Geppetto has been swallowed by a whale. He goes to save his father, and in the process, sacrifices himself, drowning in the sea. However, the fairy appears again and saves him, turning him into a real boy. But in the real story, Pinocchio is not a good boy at all. In fact, he's quite naughty. He often laughs at Geppetto, breaks things, and causes a lot of trouble. Jiminy Cricket, who was Pinocchio's friend in the cartoon, gets hit in the head with a hammer by Pinocchio and is killed. Throughout these stories, Pinocchio is either being tormented or he's stealing and being punished. In some parts, they even set Pinocchio's wooden legs on fire. In reality, the story of Pinocchio was meant to warn naughty children about their fate. The author, with his troubled mind, never intended the story to end well and sweetly. He finished the book by having Pinocchio commit suicide, hanging himself from a tree. This story was so agonizing for publishers that they had to change the ending. They decided to revive Pinocchio, and that's when the Fairy of Salvation comes and brings him back to life. After being revived, he faces more punishment and beatings, once almost being eaten by a giant and another time being swallowed by a snake, among other horrific things. Overall, it's been a terrifying story and wasn't meant for children. The next story is about the Little Mermaid, which I'm sure you all know. But if you don't, let me tell you about it. It's about a 16-year-old mermaid who gets bored underwater and dreams of joining the human world. One day, a ship sinks, and she saves a prince, falling in love with him instantly. She's willing to do anything to be with him, so she goes to a sea witch who gives her a pair of legs in exchange for her voice. The witch tells her that if she can't get a kiss of true love from the prince within 3 days, she'll turn back into a sea creature and the witch will keep her forever. Everything goes well until Ariel almost gets the kiss from Eric, the prince. However, the witch interferes, turning herself into a beautiful girl using Ariel's voice to trick Eric. Ariel's friends reveal the truth to Eric, and he kills the witch. Eric and Ariel then live happily ever after. The real story of The Little Mermaid is quite different from the animated version. In the real story, Ariel is a girl who has to wait until she turns 15 to join the mermaids on the surface and watch ships and humans. During this time, Ariel's grandmother tells her many truths, one of which is that humans live up to 100 years while mermaids live up to 300 years, after which they become ocean foam. When Ariel finally goes to see the ships, she falls in love with a man on board, who she saves after the ship sinks. However, before he wakes up, another woman rescues him, and Ariel, feeling betrayed, seeks help from the sea witch. The witch gives her legs in exchange for her voice and warns her that if she fails to get a kiss of true love from the prince within 3 days, she will turn into sea foam. After Ariel takes the potion, she falls unconscious and is rescued by the prince. They become close, but the prince believes another woman saved him and plans to marry her. Ariel, unable to speak, cannot tell him the truth. Heartbroken, she attends the wedding but is given a chance by her sisters, who give her a magic dagger. If she kills the prince with it, she can return to being a mermaid. However, Ariel realizes her love for the prince is greater than her desire to be a mermaid again. She throws the dagger away and jumps into the sea, becoming foam. Mother Nature, seeing Ariel's selflessness, gives her a soul, transforming her into one of the wind's spirits. After 300 years as a wind spirit, she can finally ascend to heaven. And that was the stories for this episode of the origin story of cartoons. If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure to like it, subscribe, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Let us know which cartoons you'd like to see in the next episode. See you next time. Goodbye for now.